CJ.
How's it going?
It is going pretty well. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you also. Sorry about the wait there.
No worries. I started mentioning some of the stuff that Jim had mentioned, and I wanted to say I'm actually doing another video on your stuff that I've already made, and I'm premiering it tomorrow, and I showed your opening statement fully in that video. So I wanted to not go through that exact opening statement, but I wanted to talk about it because I think you did a wonderful job.
Absolutely. I appreciate that also. I'll definitely want to check that out actually, because I always do appreciate getting some good feedback on these things, especially from believers. It's one thing to hear, the unbelievers review you, but to have believers actually review you and let you know what you did right, what you did wrong, that's always really good.
No, here's what I liked about, or among the many things I liked about your opening statement. I thought the whole debate went really well, and I think that he kind of argued against his own points, because he would say that Moses didn't exist after mentioning that Josephus mentioned that Moses did exist.
Right.
So, and then the two wives. I mean, if you look at Josephus's account, he had a wife that was during the time when he was living in Egypt, but when he fled, he didn't bring the wife with him. I mean, it doesn't mention that he brought the wife with him. So that's just, then he met Jethro's daughter.
Well, and it is interesting. I after that debate, I ended up looking up, because I was curious, does Moses actually have two wives in the wilderness, or am I making that up, And so I looked at it, and as it turns out, Cushite was kind of a slur for a dark-skinned person. So it's totally possible that Zipporah is the quote-unquote Cushite, and that she's actually a Midianite, but they're calling her a Cushite because she's dark-skinned. And I actually didn't even know that beforehand. So I may have been wrong when I said that Moses had two wives at the time. There actually is some pretty good, and apparently also the rabbis, not that they're necessarily infallible or anything, of course, but the rabbis actually claimed the same thing. They claimed that it was actually Zipporah was just a dark-skinned Midianite. And of course, we've all met Arabs who look like they might be darker than Arabs, right? So it's not like that's an unreasonable thing, but I just wanted to note that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's even reasonable to say, if you look at the Josephus account, which I read through it really carefully, I noticed that he mentioned that he actually went to war for the Pharaoh. He was representing the army, and he did a really good job. And apparently he was really good looking, according to Josephus. But he did all this stuff, and he attracted the daughter of this king over in this different place when he was warring. And so that's when he got married to her, it says. But then when it talks about the time when he fled Egypt, it doesn't say anything about bringing this woman with him. So there's a potential that there's just another woman and that he met that other woman while he was away from Egypt after he had fled from it. And so I mean, it's not unusual for these men in the Old Testament to get married a bunch of times and not to worry about divorce or anything like that. So,
right, no kidding. And in fact, it's interesting that God seemingly is wrath with Abraham for having Hagar. It's almost like a vision of things to come, right? Because Abraham himself is not actually held to any monogamous law, and yet God is kind of like, no, your wife is Sarah, And I always found that to be interesting, because it's almost like a type of what God is going to say in the future. But anyway, not that that's necessarily here nor there.
Well, that's another point that you were making to Jim. So I want to let's talk about, and we could even play back some of this if we want. But Jim's basic argument, I thought, was he's going to say that. Actually, I'm probably going to rephrase this wrong, but he says that. Oh, I know what it was. Okay, he says that they created the religious narrative, and then they created the history to match up with the narrative. I think that's his basic argument. Did you see that coming through?
Yeah, and it seems almost as if the idea kind of was that, so you have this, and I've heard this before from Matt Dillahunty as well, you have this group of people that's going through a bunch of struggles, i.e. the Israelites, right? And so they're crafting, this is their theory, right? They're crafting a history that, while being in line with their religion, really explains why all of this bad stuff is happening to them. Why are we exiled? Why are we constantly attacked? Why are we losing our sovereignty? All these sorts of things. It's not like that's an incredibly unreasonable opinion, but the problem with it is that our oldest works that we know of, some of them I would argue are even older, but the ones that we all agree on, like Isaiah, like Hosea, like Amos, right? They actually predate the exile by a couple centuries. almost 300 in the case of Amos. So, you know, it's not, like I said, it's not that the idea itself is unreasonable, but it's almost as if like we have history, this religion, this history that's within the religion, because Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, all these oldest texts mention Moses and the Exodus. They already have this pre-existent history and faith. It doesn't appear that it's being crafted, in other words, you know?
Yeah. Well, even what you mentioned. So, I mean, why would they craft a story of the Passover, for example? Why would they make up a story where you've got to go out and find a blemish-free lamb and sacrifice a lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the door? I mean, it just sounds, it's why would they make something silly like that up? And the whole story is that they were able to get away miraculously. Moses parted the Red Sea or the Reed Sea or whatever, and they were able to get away. And so Jim says there's no archaeological evidence. And I don't know, I've actually seen archaeological evidence depending on which time and which pharaoh was in ruling at the time, because I notice in Josephus he says the king and the pharaoh, they don't mention the name of the person, unfortunately. And so people have assumed three things: either Dudimos or Amenhotep II, or the other pharaoh is Ramses. And Ramses is the one that a lot of the movies have gone after, like Charlton Heston. But people like Inspiring Philosophy make a really compelling case for Amenhotep II, and because he's able to cite a lot of archaeological evidence during his time period of things like lambs that had, you know, just a whole bunch of, you can find lamb carcasses, like the bones to small lambs that look like they hadn't been injured in any way, because we weren't supposed to injure them. Besides, you know, you kill them, but you weren't supposed to break their bones. And right. And he also found a lot of evidence of infant bones, and that would speak to the firstborn males being killed.
Well, and so I have always more been in kind of inclined to the patterns of evidence theories, David Rolls.
I like that too.
Well, and I'll be kind of clear in that I don't, you know, I understand that it's kind of a fringe theory, only because it is new, right? Of course, it's not one of those things where it's been around for 100 years and scholars have decided to reject it. But I think they provide a pretty solid amount of evidence for Dudimos being the pharaoh of the Exodus. I'm not opposed to the idea of Amenhotep II, though. My biggest thing, I think, with believing the David Roll dates is honestly, it has a lot to do with the first portion of what we might term the Exodus story, right? Which, of course, is actually pre-Exodus. It's Joseph. But it does seem like in the region of Avaris, which is where we would consider Goshen to be, you have a lot of Semites, not necessarily named Semites, but a lot of Semites in the area. And they're there with the blessing of the native-born pharaohs. And they are rising to power and rising up to great ranks, even to the point of potentially even having some viziers and maybe even some pharaohs that were partially Semitic. I get, you know, you look at the 12th and 13th dynasty, it's possible. And then all of a sudden they become very impoverished. They become very enslaved. There's no record as to why, but it happens, right? They start to have a population of 3 women to 1 man. And then all of a sudden they're just gone. And they seemingly disappear overnight. And as soon as they disappear, some new Semites come to take their place, i.e. these Hyksos. And the Hyksos, when they show up, they're violent and they're conquerors and they're brutish and all that, but they're not actually forced to do anything like that. You know what I mean? Like the Egyptians seemingly are broken, which would make sense, of course, if Dudimos' army has just been wiped out in the sea. And if a lot of, you know, the famines and the plagues and stuff like that have destroyed crops, have destroyed livestock, have destroyed people. It would seemingly make a lot of sense just kind of lining up in that way. The issue, of course, with the Dudimos theory is that you have to change Egyptian chronology. It only works if Egyptian chronology is shortened by at least 200 years. And it's possible that that's a necessary component of this, but it's not something that people are very fond of.
Yeah, well, I can sort of see that. And I think that the idea that we're able to actually at least try to look at the information that is out there in a clear way without having an inbred bias to say, okay, well, let's figure it out. Maybe, you know, could it be Dudimos? Could it be Amenhotep II? Could it be somebody else? And Jim was saying, well, we don't know. A lot of his theory was rotating around, we don't know exactly when this happened, therefore Moses didn't exist. And I don't think that follows.
Well, and I also think it kind of depends on what you mean by when too. And I know that's a weird thing to say because you know it isn't all time the same time, but from a historical perspective, not really. We're obviously having to put together two separate and non-related chronologies when trying to figure this out, one in Egypt and one in the Bible, right? In the Bible, when we do have pretty clearly, as far as setting out like when events are supposed to take place, it's roughly the 1450s BC. And assuming that we have all our other dates right on which we build that chronology, which really the big date is the conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, 586 or 587. It's kind of differentiated in the year, but the point is, if we have that date right, and we're incredibly confident that we do, then 1450 is roughly, right, circa, is where we would expect the Exodus to be. The problem with that, though, is now what is 1450 on the Egyptian calendar, right? Could it be Amenhotep? Could it be Thutmose III? Could it be Dudimos? I guess we're not necessarily sure. The Ramses one, just to briefly mention, the Ramses theory is actually so frequently dismissed by a lot of conservative scholars precisely because of the fact that we actually do have our functioning biblical chronology. And it seems like that would be the best example I've heard of it actually working is, well, a generation isn't actually 40 years. It's closer to 23, 25. And if you do that math, it's closer to 300 if you multiply that number by 12. Possible. But there's no multiplications by 12 or anything like that in Solomon's dedication to the temple. So long story short is one of these two chronologies we do have very solid, actually. It's really just a matter of, do we have the right interpretation of this second chronology? And personally, I don't think that we do. And I would point out, you know, the Egyptian chronology does not only contradict, as it's understood today, does not only contradict Israelite history, but a couple other people's histories as well. And this is something that is frequent in Egypt, right? They were propagandists. They like to report things that were not necessarily true. The Merneptah Stele is, of course, a perfect example where they're going out, they're saying, we completely destroyed all these people. All of those people to a people group show up in later tradition. Israel, of course, is the one we all know, but Israel, the Shasu, every single one of them, right? The point being, it was propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's I think those are really good arguments when you talk about why certain things might not have been reported of pharaohs if it made the pharaohs look bad. And so the pharaoh's not going to commission somebody to report on the fact that a bunch of Jewish people got away.
Right. And, you know, we often kind of look at these guys as, you know, as if they were at least somewhat objective. And I think that it's somewhat comical that we do. All of us today know that it doesn't matter if it's President Bush or President Biden or President Trump or whatever, right? We all know dude's got an agenda, dude's got propaganda, dude wants to make himself look as good as he can, right? And in a free country where we elect our people, where we have a free press, where we have the internet and all that kind of stuff, he still manages, whoever that he happens to be, to set up some pretty solid propaganda for himself. Now we take that to Egypt, take that same rule. This is how leaders apparently act. Take it to the Egyptians. Now the Egyptians don't have to worry about all this technology when they're spreading their lies. They don't have freedom, right? They're not electing these people, in other words. And the pharaoh is a divine figure. So his propaganda is obviously going to be significantly worse than the propaganda that we experience every single day. And yet we fully acknowledge that we experience propaganda from our political class, if you will, every day, right, left, center. We all acknowledge it, right? So why is it so weird for us to believe, hey, maybe these pharaohs are propagandistic, just like our own leaders, maybe even a little bit worse than our own leaders? I think it's fairly obvious. And I mean, we don't have anything akin to the Merneptah Stele in American history, right? Where it's like, this is an outright lie. But it's, you know, it's propaganda, and it's frequent, very frequent in, what would you call that? Egyptian history.
Yeah, that brings up a couple other points that when you're talking about that, one of the things that you mentioned in this this debate is you said you're not going to be locked into certain numbers, like say 600,000 Jewish people or Jewish men or whatever. And so you said, I don't think we should be locked into numbers because of hyperbole. And we see evidence of hyperbole. Like when you say we slaughtered everyone, and you're really just saying, you didn't, if you go play football and you say you slaughtered the other team, you don't really mean you slaughtered the other team. Like what I'm saying. So sometimes they might exaggerate numbers, but it doesn't mean that that doubts the validity. And Jim says, well, if they exaggerated numbers, then it must mean the whole Bible is without merit.
Yeah, and the funniest thing about that one, and now I do in separate conversations, I will defend the 600,000 number simply because I do think that the Bible is inerrant. Now, of course, I'm open to interpretations about that may be different from my own. But from a strictly historical perspective, right? If we're just having this conversation, did the Exodus happen? Did Moses exist? All that kind of stuff. It's not even just that it's possibly exaggerated. It's literally irrelevant. And what do I mean by that? So you have Thermopylae, right? This huge, massive battle in Greek history, a battle that literally could be one of the points where it was, this goes one way and Western civilization isn't, and this goes another way and Western civilization is, right? And it's like that big of a battle. But there wasn't a million Persians there. Virtually everybody agrees with that. Now, there might be some scholar out there on the fringes somewhere, all respect to him or her, but who thinks, no, Herodotus got this right. It's really a 1,000,000-man army. But the overwhelming majority of us are, no, it's probably closer to 100,000, which is a factor of 10. That's a huge exaggeration. But none of us are claiming here that Thermopylae didn't happen. None of us claim Leonidas wasn't king. None of us claim that Xerxes wasn't king. None of us claim that there wasn't 300 Spartans. You know what I mean? Like the whole story itself is accurate. It's just Herodotus may have fudged the number a little bit. And this is a hugely common thing in the ancient world. I'll give just a couple of examples just because we could literally make a whole show about it. The Sumerian kings list is widely considered to be a list of actual kings who did.
Wait, hold on just 1 second. I want to get to that in just 1 second. Jim Majors is in the chat right now, and I don't have any way to contact Jim Majors because he doesn't follow me on Twitter, but and I don't know what his email address is or anything like that. Do you have his information to contact him?
I actually was contacting him on Twitter when we had set up our debate. So that would be the best way I would suggest, actually.
Because I don't know if you'd want to bring him in here to because it looks like he says, "Where was my invite? Rude and biased, unsubscribing."
He's a funny dude. I'm totally okay with it. Yeah. If you'd like to come in and talk, that's certainly all right.
All right, Jim, you can come in here if you want. I can't contact you, so I'm going to have. Can you CJ? Can you send him a DM with the link that I sent you?
Yeah, I can definitely do that.
Okay. So I'll just wait, and you can still keep going on because you were just giving some really good examples of some wars back then when we saw some hyperbole.
Yeah, absolutely. And the second example here that I think is a really strong one is the Sumerian kings list, because it's not actually this example. It's kind of funny because it's not actually a battle, right? It's a list of different monarchs who have allegedly ruled over this area. But when you look at the numbers, and this is, again, I want to point out, this is something where we typically do agree, as far as historians are concerned, that these kings are real, right? That Gilgamesh was a real king, and so on and so forth. I don't know all the names very well.
Yeah, like Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi came from Hammurabi.
Exactly. Or Sargon of Akkad is another one, right?
Oh, that's one Jim brought up. He brought up Sargon, and he said because Sargon of Akkad, there's a story that Sargon was put into a river similar to the way that Moses was put into the river. Therefore, it follows that Moses doesn't exist. And I thought you kind of tore apart that one pretty well, because you said a lot of times we have certain things that happen in people's lives. Like Abraham Lincoln could be compared very well with John F. Kennedy in certain ways.
And in some ways, even creepily, right? Like I think it's his Secretary of State is named Lincoln, and Lincoln's Secretary of State is named Kennedy or something like that. Which is
really?
Like, that's weird.
That is weird.
But it's just weird, like there's nothing special about it.
Like something in history could happen. Maybe there's some tradition. Maybe there's something in history, like somebody shoots a president. Somebody shot Abraham Lincoln. Somebody shot John F. Kennedy. So therefore, John F. Kennedy doesn't exist.
Well, and you could even give like a really strong example so Hercules and Samson, both with their bare hands kill a lion, right? And they're completely unrelated stories. We know they're unrelated stories because by the time the Jews actually come into contact with the Greeks, Judges is completely written, as is the 12 Labors. So they come into contact with each other and they have these stories, Samson and Hercules, very similar, real strong people, divine strength, even though in one case it's demigod, in one case it's the power of God, it's still divine strength, right? It's seemingly, this person is seemingly tied with like slaughtering beasts and stuff like that. Both of them do kill a lion, but also, of course, Hercules slays a hydra, and Samson, I think, kills a bear is the other animal, if I'm not mistaken. I know he takes honey out of one of them, but I think that's actually the lion. But nonetheless, the point is, there's very, very similar comparisons to be made between Samson and Hercules. And in fact, I'm probably even doing a disservice to it. Somebody who's more knowledgeable about Heracles' own myth would probably be able to show the examples even much stronger than I am. You can have an example like King David. I mean, how many kings are considered to be the rightful heir, but somebody else holds the crown, so they leave and then come back with an army and take over once this person is dead from their son? That's like a constant motif in ancient history. But that's, of course, the King David story also. And the best way I've had to describe it is people are not very unique. We like to think we're a lot more unique than we are, but really there's a finite number of experiences that a person can have. If you've had that experience, the statistical likelihood is overwhelming that a couple people you know have also had that experience, let alone other people in the whole of humanity's history.
Yeah. I mean, it's totally reason. Well, I think what you did, Synagogue, and you guys, you have to go make sure you subscribe to CJ's channel. But what you did is you laid out what you called the criterion, and you laid out a number of different criterion. And I thought that was really good. And I think you said stuff like the criterion of embarrassment. You had a lot of those. Do you want to kind of recount some of, because those are, I think, the key arguments in favor of the historicity of Moses.
Yeah. So there's a criterion a lot of scholars use today, known as the criterion of authenticity, right? And it's actually a combination of multiple different criterion that they all use to collectively decide whether or not something is likely historical or not. So the most famous of these, at least for a lot of lay people, is like myself, of course, is the criterion of embarrassment. And the criterion of embarrassment basically is, so you have a figure, the figure is supposed to be a hero. If the figure is doing something which seems embarrassing to them, chances are it probably happened. Why? Because if you're inventing a hero, you want that hero to be in a good light. You're to be represented in a good light, right? Double points if this particular event doesn't seem to have narrative value, right? So in other words, you're reading the story of, let's just say Star Wars, right? Because it's one that everybody knows. Anakin's the hero, but Anakin's fall in episode 3 is narratively important, right? In other words, he doesn't get the redemption arc without the fall arc, right? But if you have something like, for example, Moses telling God, no, I don't actually want to go and free these people, find somebody else, I'm slow of speech, all that. None of that actually holds serious narrative value. It's really just Moses being a coward and God telling him, I'm sorry, my decision is final. And it doesn't go anywhere from there, right? You could say, okay, well, maybe that's how we include Aaron. All right, that's fine. But still, Aaron isn't hugely important to the story, number one. And number two, you could have gotten Aaron there just simply with the speech impediment. You don't actually need the, I don't want to go, and the cowardiceness, frankly, that we actually see from Moses. And of course, this isn't the only example of an embarrassing thing with Moses. You have the instance with the circumcision of his son on the way to Egypt, where Zipporah calls him a bloody husband. You have the striking of the rock. You have constant arguing with God. Moses is not shy about telling the Lord his opinions. And he's not disrespectful, don't get me wrong. But like, for example, when God says, I'm going to disinherit these people, Moses's response is actually, Okay, but you took these people out of Egypt, and all the Egyptians know, and so you're just going to take them out to slay them. What then will the Egyptians say? Oh, this God, he showed all these signs just so he can take these people out and kill them in the desert, right? And it's like, you're thinking like, that's a bold way to speak to your king, let alone the ultimate king, right?
Yeah.
Does. I think I already mentioned the striking of the rock, but the point is so on and so forth, right? We get constant examples of embarrassing things with Moses, that if you're wanting to create a cultural hero, somebody like a Gilgamesh or a Hercules or something like that, a Yao the Great from China, right? You probably would not include those things if you were inventing them. That's, of course, only one criterion, though. There's also the criterion of dissimilarity. The criterion of dissimilarity basically is, do we have examples of things that happen in the Exodus story that seem out of place? In other words, so the Jews don't follow idolatry, for example, right? And that, of course, comes from Moses, the second commandment, don't commit any idolatry. So then when you have a story like the snake in the wilderness, where Moses has the rod with the snake and the staff on it, right? So that would be something that falls under the criterion of dissimilarity. If you were inventing this story, that's probably not something you would want to include, because the second commandment clearly forbids idolatry, and this appears, at least on its face, to be idolatry, right? And now, of course, I think there's theological explanations for that, but the point still kind of remains that it is not what you would expect given the tradition of the culture later on.
Let me add one to yours, and I think this fits with both of those, dissimilarity and also the criterion of embarrassment, is how them circling around the wilderness for 40 years before they're finally let into Canaan, to the land of milk and honey. And so that itself is that's one of the things that atheists like. There's no evidence that he circled around for 40 years. These people circled around for 40 years. And it's just, that itself is kind of embarrassing. I mean, why didn't it just happen in 2 weeks later? Why did they have to go around for 40 years?
Right. And even, not even just that, because, of course, the 40 years that they're actually wandering is basically constant murmur and complain and judgment, and Moses saying, please have mercy and all. I mean, Numbers is kind of a rough book in a way, Numbers, and of course Leviticus and Deuteronomy are included, but Numbers itself can get brutal sometimes. You're kind of like, wow, I mean, these guys just, I mean, I guess there's a line, right? You cross the line.
They didn't like the food. Hey, I just want to mention to the audience, just so they know, I did remember that I did have Jim Major's Gmail address. So I just Gmailed him to this Gmail address that's, let me just see which one this is. Where'd it go? He was like disciple of something. So I just emailed him the link. So if he wants to come in, he can come in, but he hasn't, he's not shown up. So maybe he doesn't want to come in anymore. Or maybe he never did.
Well, might have been, oh, excuse me. Just choked on my coffee a little bit. Sorry. I might have been, joking also. I know he is kind of a little bit of a jokester. I actually kind of like that about Jim. He's a funny guy. Sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought when I started coughing there.
No, so you were talking about the criterion of dissimilarity, and we talked about the 40 years of wandering, which was, and they were complaining all the time. They were like, oh, this manna from heaven. They didn't want to, oh, Jim Majors is here. They didn't want to eat the manna. They thought they would like the food better in Egypt. I mean, they were just.
Yeah. And excuse me. One of the things that kind of adds to this criterion of dissimilarity also is, people say there are contradictions in Torah. Now, of course, I will defend these alleged contradictions, right? But if we're just ignoring that for a second and just sticking with the historicity argument, well, is it Reuel or is it Jethro? The fact that you have both does seemingly indicate that you have both existing as a tradition. If you were making it up, you'd be smart enough probably to make up the same name both times, right? But when you have these two different existing traditions, it does seemingly imply either that there are two separate existing traditions, or that Jethro was also called Reuel, which is what I think is the likely answer to that. But it's just another example of, even within Torah itself, the criterion of dissimilarity is still met. And importantly, the criterion of dissimilarity is juxtaposed with another criterion that can potentially create contradictions if the two are not, I guess, balanced is the way you could put it. And that is the criterion of consistency or coherency. depending on how you want to put it. Basically, the idea is if you have 5 stories that tell 5 different tales of the same person, chances are that the person's tale doesn't actually exist, or at least that you can't figure out which one it is, right?
Yeah, let me just go up. I just want to say in chapter 12 of Antiquities of the Jews, it says, now Moses, when he had obtained the favor of Jethro, for that was one of the names of Raguel. So that's what you're saying. It actually, Josephus tells us who that is.
Right.
Well, Josephus also tells us that. Oh, hi, by the way. Josephus also tells us that he had another wife, and he doesn't mention this this Midianite Zipporah, but instead it's a Cushite woman who's the daughter of an Ethiopian king, King Meles.
Yeah, and I think I kind of tried to address how I think that works, but I think that he took that wife after he'd gone to war and he was still in the favor of the Pharaoh. And then after he fled, Josephus doesn't mention that he brought that wife with him. And then, of course, he met this other wife. And so I think you can make a case that he had a wife. He had 2 wives.
Well, and I've also, I do want to, because Jim, I actually had given a similar response to what SJ just gave. But I have actually, since our debate, figured out that apparently calling somebody a Cushite in ancient Hebrew culture was kind of a racial slur for somebody.
It could have been a pejorative of her skin color, but then you have the issue of the name and then the identification of who her father was.
Well, and in that, I do think that is a interesting question for sure. What I would say, though, is I think that historically speaking, and of course, this doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. I'm just simply laying this out as what I think is a good rule. Just because we accept some or even most of what Josephus says doesn't necessarily mean that all of it is true. I think.
Sure. I think most people agree who study Josephus that he's not entirely reliable. And I want to say I completely agree with you what you had said earlier about 2 existing traditions. You know, it's either that the differences can be explained by either there were 2 different existing traditions, or that they're somehow coinciding. You know, like for instance, the Numbers 20 and Exodus 17. You know, where you have this these 2 different stories about Moses striking the rock. You know, is it 1 story or is it 2? Well, like you were talking about how Numbers is brutal. You know, Numbers is like, you know, the punishments are always awful. Well, you know, in Numbers, you know, Moses is punished. In Exodus, he's not. Then you have the issue with the quail that's duplicated in both Exodus and Numbers. You have one where they're not punished and one where they are. Them complaining in about the about leaving Egypt. You know, in Exodus 17, you know, they say, well, why'd you bring us up from Egypt to kill our children and livestock? But in Numbers, there's not any of that brutality. You know, it says, well, just why did you bring us up out of Egypt? Or when Moses, when they're saying, you know, when God tells Moses to gather all the elders of the tribes and to take his staff, which and to set out with it. In Exodus, you know, he specifically says to take the staff which you struck the Nile and set out. But in Numbers, he just says, you and your brother Aaron take the staff and assemble the community. So alone, just looking at the verses that outline the striking of the rock and whether or not he was punished, it could be explained, you know, that he was punished, but it just wasn't mentioned by omission. But as a whole case by itself, you know, once you put all of these different issues together, it does seem like there were at least 2 different existing traditions.
Jim, let me ask you this. I want to see if I've got the basic gist of your argument, because I was listening to it and I thought that at some points it seems like you acknowledge that Moses existed by acknowledging that Josephus mentioned him in that. But then at other points you said something like you think that the Jewish people crafted a narrative that was based on their religious tradition, and then they invented a history to fit this narrative. Is that accurate as a steelman?
Somewhat. So I don't think that because Josephus mentioned Moses and this other wife means that Moses existed, because I don't find Josephus to be credible. For one, Joseph, while he's writing the Antiquity of the Jews, he's writing the Antiquity of the Jews for the same reason that most people write antiquities of their religions in ancient times, and it was to establish a provenance and a superiority over competing traditions.
Okay, so well, and that could actually well be part of his reasoning behind establishing that, because the Jewish people did feel that they were the chosen people of God, and so they felt like they had certain superiority. I think that's fair to say.
Well, sure, and they were also, living in very Hellenistic societies,
Mhm.
and so they were competing with with Greek culture, with Roman
Mhm.
culture, with they were in places of high trade, so they were experiencing people coming from Persia, people coming from other parts of Africa.
Mhm.
Well, and one thing I do think is kind of important here. Well, there's a couple things really. Just because it's obviously it's a deep topic, right? It's all these mythicist questions really are. One thing I will say is I do think that Josephus is a good source. I just think that everybody should always take any historian. And it's funny, we have people like there's the anti-Herodotus crowd, the anti-Eusebius crowd, the anti-Tacitus crowd, the anti-Josephus crowd, right? And it's because they're like, well, we can find X, Y, and Z wrong with what they had written down. And I think when you listen to actual historians like a Bart Ehrman or a Mike Lacona, and of course those are two on the different spectrums theologically, but both historians, right? It's interesting. They both accept what I think we all should accept, which is the historians are probably mostly right, but they can't be. They're not infallible. In fact, many times they're recording, and I think Herodotus is the best example of this, because Herodotus seems kind of almost whimsical with what he puts down. A lot of times they're just recording stories as
Sure.
it has been passed down. You know what I mean? And they're not lying or anything like that. They're just,
Right. Well, I think that ancient historians are a very good source, not of determining historicity of the events, but determining the historicity of the beliefs at that time. So, so I think that Josephus is probably accurately reflecting what people believed about the things that he's writing. But I don't think that he's a good source of determining whether or not the things that he's saying is historical.
Yeah, so I would completely agree with that, actually, and I'd even go as far as to say even his sources, Manetho, is still 1,000 years after the Exodus, right?
Exactly. And Manetho's still writing with the bias too, because Manetho would just be writing about the Hyksos for no reason. There's it's all done with a purpose.
Right, a polemic, if you will, almost.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole militarized band of lepers. That's just it just screams a polemic to me.
So do you think that Jim, I think on this underlying idea that you create a history to match your narrative, why would they do that, and why wouldn't Jewish people were very particular about having their information accurate. And we know that because we can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and see how that was accurate against the Old Testament. And so I'm wondering how you think that somebody would come across and just say, okay, I'm going to invent this history because this is our religion. Why wouldn't you just acknowledge the history and maybe discount the religion? Because you don't believe in the religion.
Well, so do you believe in the historicity of Adam and Eve as the first two people, and this place called Eden, and a global flood, and all these other things? No, of course not. But
well, no, I do believe in Adam and Eve, and I do believe that there could have been a flood. Now, I think that the flood could have been a local flood that was rocking their world, if you want to call it that.
A local flood that extended 15 cubits over the highest mountain.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that extend beyond locally?
It could. I don't know how big. I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily, in my view, I don't think it needs to cover the entire Earth. I think it's possible that it extended into this part of this region in some area. And I haven't looked at I haven't looked at the geology to see exactly where that would go.
So what you're saying is that the text does not necessarily reflect historicity.
I think that you can
actually, if I may,
go ahead
on that a little bit. Just because I actually, there are two different things which I happen to believe with which both come into play here. And it is a good thing to separate them. And I'd be interested, because I think, SJ, you might have a similar view here. But on one end, I do believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And so I obviously take that source differently than I would any other historical source, right? On another end, though, I am of the belief that it is more likely that mythical figures exist, even if incredibly exaggerated, than that mythical figures are fiction. What I mean by that is, even if I were not a believer, I still find it very unlikely that they made the story of Noah up. Maybe they got it wrong, because at this point I'm not a believer. I don't have to take it 100% literally anymore, right? Mm-hmm. But it seems unlikely to me that people are just inventing these stories. It seems more likely that they have this figure, kind of like what happens with George Washington in our own culture, right? We have this figure and we just deify this figure to a point where, you know, we don't have magical things with Washington, but honestly, if we didn't have modern technology, we might. We do have a lot of false stories about Washington, like the cherry tree example being the most famous. And we certainly have fictional stories about other presidents like Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt, right? Mm-hmm. Theodore Roosevelt being only like 100 years old. The point being, sure, it makes more sense to me to have these figures mythologized over time than it does to say that these figures did not exist. And I would apply that to most other figures as well. Like, I think it's likely a Hercules-like figure probably existed in the distant past. Achilles, sure. I wouldn't be surprised if Achilles was an actual general at Troy, because the Trojan War seems to be something that happened in history. I'm not an expert on that, but it appears
most historians and archaeologists don't agree with that, because there's no evidence for that. But like, I mean, and I agree with you to an extent. You know, that there are many people that we can see, like such as Jesus, who we can determine a core of historicity for. But at some point, you know, the being able to identify them with a historical person, it has to go from history to either legend or to total myth. And as to whether Moses is more of a legend or a myth, I don't know. But it would be the equivalent of somebody saying, you know, say almost 3,000 years from now, somebody discovers this story about C.J. Cox, and he lived in 1930, in the 1930s, and he was the son of a preacher, and he had a mega church, and he was a very, very popular pastor, and he did debates, and he was often depicted as wearing a hat. They say, okay, well, did C.J. Cox exist? Well, is there historical, you know, core? Is there core historicity for this character, C.J. Cox? So, I mean, yes, but did C.J. Cox exist? I mean, as he's portrayed, no. So then, who is C.J. Cox? You know, that's the question that I would ask about Moses: is who is Moses? Is Moses somebody who led an exodus that resulted in the devastation of Pharaoh's entire army? And the person who reintroduced the Israelites back into Israel? Probably not, especially considering, you know, that the land was still under Egyptian rule and occupation at that time. So
let me Jim, let me go to that, because I think I want to clarify two things that you said. One is I think from what I've read on your Twitter account in the past, I think you don't think that Jesus is merely a myth. Am I correct on that?
Yes, correct. More, I would say much more legendary. There are mythologized aspects to the Jesus story, but I don't think that Jesus as a character is a mythological figure.
Okay, good. So, but going back to Moses, how do you get past the fact that Moses's name has been mentioned 847 times in the Bible in many different by many different authors over a long period of time, but even, you know, going back to his mm-hmm. contemporaneous time? How do you? I mean, isn't it just a safer bet to just say, yes, sure, the Moses existed. Maybe you don't believe some of the stories around Moses, but I
mean, not at all.
The man himself existed.
Not at all. In fact, I think that's a bad argument to use his name for two reasons. One reason is that the first mention of his name isn't for over 1,000 years after the time that he's supposed to have lived. And the second reason is that in the Bible it says that it has his name as being Hebrew for being drawn out of the water, which is wrong for two reasons. One, it means to be the drawer out of the water, to be the one who draws out, and two, because that type of Hebrew that would have been used to identify Moses with the one who draws out of water is one that is a first millennia BCE type of Hebrew versus the claimed second millennium origin of Moses.
So and I saw that, and I actually remember that from the debate that you made that same point. And so I looked into Josephus and what he said on that, because he actually looked at the person who gave him the name Moses wasn't his mother or wasn't anyone like that. It was the woman who was the daughter of the Pharaoh who pulled him out of the sea. And it says that the word Mo and Zes, Josephus explained why she chose the name Moses. She wasn't a Hebrew speaking woman. And so, I mean, she's Egyptian. So,
well,
so I'm not sure how that
there's
argument.
There's traditions that his mother actually named him as well. And actually pretty early rabbinic traditions that his mother, being the milk nurse, or the actually suggested the name to the Pharaoh's daughter. So there's a lot of traditions for how Moses got his name.
Well, and I would actually to be honest, I would want to do a couple things. I think first here. So the first thing, I do think I would want to push back on the etymology thing that people say. So first off, I do think that it is very likely that Moses is both a derivative of Masha and a derivative of son of. Why do I say that? Well, because first off, they're both languages that they're very close to each other. I don't know if they're both.
Wait. Are you talking about the text, or are you talking about the origin of his actual name, like him being given this name?
I'm saying like the origin of his actual name, because it seems to me, so it seems virtually impossible that the etymology given in the Bible is wrong, because if you take Masha and Moshe and you write them both, they actually look identical. If you don't have Tiberian vowels, which aren't invented until 1000 AD, and of course you're going to be using the Proto-Canaanite script, not the modern Hebrew script, but the point still actually stands. The words look identical. You can't even tell the difference except for context, right?
You can when you look at the construction of it in a verb form.
Well, right, but the meaning. What I mean though is if you just had the word Masha itself to draw, right, and you had it next to the word Moshe, the rest of the sentence is what you would determine how you would say that word. Because if you're just looking at them, they're spelt exactly the same. It's a mem, shin, and a hey.
Right. Well, that goes with most ancient languages. I mean, the structure and the placement of it in the subject verb object relationship has a lot to do with interpreting.
Very true.
Let me just say, because I've got Josephus right in front of me, so I can see exactly what he said. He said, hereupon it was that Thermuthis imposed the name Moses upon him from what happened when he was put into the river. For the Egyptians call water by the name of Mo, and such as are saved out of it, and he's got that in italics, by the name of Usus. And so by putting these two words together, and they imposed the name upon him. They imposed this name upon him. So that's what it says from Josephus.
Right. Saver of, not being saved from the water, but saving people from the water.
Well, and I do want to kind of though hammer a little bit on this Moshe Masha point though, because it does seem to me, because you made a good point there, Jim, that this is just kind of how these words work, right? As far as the Semitic languages in particular, they're all based off of these 3 consonant roots that we shuffle the vowels and verb forms around in order to make sentences, right?
Well, not the vowels. The vowels have no bearing when it comes to ancient Hebrew.
Well, not to ancient, right, but to the way you would pronounce it, I guess, into the word, right? So, for example, Malak and Melech are going to be spelt the same way. Not Malak as in the god, but M-L-M-A-L-A-K to spell it phonetically, to reign, right? Those are going to be spelled
Malak,
the same
yeah.
way, but the way that somebody would pronounce them in ancient Hebrew would be different given the context, right? So you're when I'm saying shifting the vowels, it's not necessarily the written vowels. The things that are written are going to be the verb forms and all that, but it's the way you're actually pronouncing the word.
Not just pronounce, but what the word means, because using those same letters, we can also make the word for messenger, malach. So I mean, there's a lot that you can do with ancient Hebrew, especially when we're looking at just the 3-character root words.
Right, and I fully agree. Right, so now, this is why I actually think it makes the point really strongly that the etymology used in Exodus is true. Right, what we know about these languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, the like, right, is that they do use these roots that aren't even necessarily words, although they usually are, but more like concepts, right? And the build the rest of the names and words and verb forms that are describing this same thing with the same roots. So like for example, I already used Mem Lamed Kaf, right? The Melech. So you have Melech, Malak, Mamluk, Memlechut, Malka, right? So on and so forth. And these are king, queen, to reign, kingdom, to make one king, right? They all build, and you can even go further, right? Melchizedek, Elimelech. Although I don't know, I don't think Elimelech is actually how you would say that in Hebrew, but nonetheless.
Elimelech,
yeah. So now, I mean, if you take that same concept, right, that we're building the names and the verbs and everything else that uses this idea off of the root that is sort of like claiming this idea, in that case, Mem Lamed Kaf, right? Moses fits that trend perfectly. Moses is a name that's spelt exactly like Mashah, which would be your root there, your mem and then your shin and then your ha, or hey, excuse me. And it's you find that root, actually within the name, just as you would expect to find any of these other things, right? And so in other words, what we know from the Hebrew language does seem to back up what we're actually seeing in the etymology from the Bible, namely that we base everything off of these root concepts of typically 3 consonants. And I would point out too, the Egyptian name that sounds an awful lot like Moses, that a lot of people, including myself, by the way, do think is related. So like Ramesses, Dudemos, right? Akmose, and of course in Hebrew, those all sound even more, or excuse me, not in Hebrew. In Egyptian, those sound even more similar than what I'm putting them out to be, because I'm just saying English.
Right. But even in Egyptian, you still have a second millennium versus first millennium interpretation, because like, just to go back to what you were saying on the 3-character root words, it can, Moses' name in the Hebrew interpretation, you can push it back to the second millennium, but when you look at the development of the cognates from those 3-word root syllable, from those 3-character root words, you don't have the development of the cognates that would lead to the different daughter roots, if you will, that would lead to the interpretation of Moses being the drawer out of the water, or the saving from the water, until the first millennium.
Let me see if I can reckon. I mean, because we have Josephus saying that the woman picked the name because of the water coming out of the water. It says right in Exodus, it says that she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So that's corresponding with one another. I know that you could say, well, Josephus was writing a history and he probably referenced some of the stuff from the Bible, but I just feel like I feel like how would you propose that? How did the 10 Commandments come about? How did the tradition of the Passover come about, Jim?
But Exodus is also a first millennium text.
I don't necessarily buy that. I believe that Moses was a part of the author of the first passages in the Bible. So I believe it was written by him, much of it. And so
if Moses had written it, it would be written in Proto-Sinaitic, Proto-Canaanite, some sort of a Proto-Hebrew script, and it wouldn't have many of the not just loan words. I mean, that's not really like the best argument to make, but just the style of Hebrew that it's written in. Even some of the oldest things that we can see that use like really old chiastic structures, really old like literary devices like synonymous parallelism and things like that. I mean, we can date the text based on the text itself, like just not what the words say or what it's claiming, but how it's structured.
See, I would
that
argue
doesn't always come through in the English.
See, I know that you are studying this stuff. I know that you're in a university right now trying to work on a PhD, or maybe you've even completed by this point. I don't know. And I know you're studying it, so I know that you're into this sort of thing. I just, some of what I believe, and I'll admit, is based on faith and the fact that Jesus made it clear that Moses wrote the Torah. I buy that. I just believe that Jesus made that clear. And so I believe that it was written around the time of 1450, no matter what the form of the writing is and whether or not it coincides. Because he said,
and you and I are in agreement, you know, that you and I also agree that it seems like that Jesus Jesus is claiming that Moses wrote the Torah, and I think that's, you know, kind of the same thing with Josephus, is that I don't believe that it's necessarily portraying the factuality of the topic, but it shows the factuality of the contemporary beliefs about that topic at the time.
Are you familiar? I'm curious to know. Are you familiar with Ivan Panin?
Panin.
I just heard of him for the first time a couple weeks ago, so it's not a big deal if you're not.
I'm honestly not sure. Ivan Panin. No, I'd have to say. Oh, is he's the one who he studied numerology, right?
Numerics. He doesn't call it numerology, but it's numerics.
Well, yeah, numerics, yeah.
One of the things, I've got a couple books by him. I'm just bringing this up really quickly. I know this is distracting, but I just want to bring it up really quickly. So I've got these two books right here. This one's called Ivan Panin's Numerics in Scripture, How Mathematics Proves Holy Scriptures by Mark Vedder and Jim Thompson. And this one's actually Ivan Panin's translation of the New Testament. The interesting thing that he identified when he went through all 66 books of the Old and New Testaments, and he also looked at the Catholic editions, is in the 66 books, he saw patterns of 7s and patterns of 11s and things like that. And he looked even in the last passages of Mark 16, 9-20, and he looked at the passage about the adulterer in John 8, and he actually realized these patterns ran through the whole thing. Then he looked at the Catholic texts, couldn't find the patterns, the additions, and they went through the Muslim texts and the Quran and couldn't find any sort of pattern similar to that. And he actually went through a number of other books, and so he actually became a Christian based on that. He's a Harvard mathematician with a PhD in mathematics, and so and he was from Russia. He came over to the United States and went to Harvard. But I'm just mentioning that because it actually offers validation for the 66 books of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And so I think it's a fascinating thing that you might just be curious just to look into that.
I mean, yeah, I've looked into these codes, these number codes that are claimed to have been in the Bible. It wasn't Ivan though, but it was a Carl Sabers. He wrote something on numerics and was saying that he went through the Greek and the Hebrew of the Old and the New Testament, and by assigning a number to a letter, that there were these secret little Easter eggs that you could find in the text that I guess further bolstered the claims that the Bible is a divinely inspired text. But he also erred in many ways, using the Septuagint, not using the Masoretic text. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with numerics, and it strongly depends on what your source document is. And the problem with that is that we have no original sources of either the Greek or the Hebrew of the Bible.
So yeah, you're right. He actually went. Ivan Panin did for the original, and that was actually a good point. My curious thing with Ivan Panin was looking at, okay, now which Greek source did he prove for the New Testament, and which source did he use for the new one? And he used Westcott and Hort for the Greek version. And actually, these authors compared that to the Nestle-Aland version of the Greek, and they put Ivan's stuff together. And so there's some pretty fascinating stuff. I mean, it's just worth a look if you're interested. I did send I was trying to get in touch with Bart Ehrman and see what he thinks of this, and wasn't able to do that.
I will look that up, and in turn, I'd ask you to check out this group called the Discovery Seminar.
Okay, that's fair.
The discovery of the Discovery Seminar is they are a Jewish group who actually go out to disprove Christianity using the same method.
That's interesting. What are the Jewish people? I mean, what are they? It's funny because I have a Jewish friend at school and I love her to death. I mean, she's one of my favorite people. And she and I, sometimes we room together at conferences and things like that. And we start talking about Jesus and stuff. And it's really funny because I'll talk about the credibility of the Old Testament, and she likes that. And then she says, you know the Old Testament better than I do. We never really look into the Old Testament. She convinced her husband to convert from Christianity to Judaism. And so I ask her sometimes, I'll say, hey, have you read Isaiah 53? And what do you think of that? And because that passage alone has been used to bring Jewish people to Jesus. And so I'm curious, Jim, I mean, what do you think of Isaiah 53 or Psalm 22 or Zechariah 12:10?
I think that they had very different meanings for the people who wrote them and for the people who were hearing them being read, in their liturgical settings or whatever. And I think it has a very different meaning from what the New Testament authors meant when they were referencing them. And I think that the way but there's a big difference between the way the New Testament authors reference them and to the way that they are interpreted by many today. So I think that the authoric intent is very, very different from what I would say is the most commonly understood perception of these texts.
CJ, I just saw you unmuted yourself. Do you want to comment?
Well, so not necessarily on those ones in particular, just because I think I could derail the conversations with those, to be honest with you.
Same here.
Well, and for the record, let me just say too, Jim, you're definitely a fun person to talk to. Like
Thanks, man. Yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation.
Are you guys going to debate again on anything?
Oh, I'm you know me, I'm always open for a good debate.
Yeah, I'm totally down. We don't have anything planned at the moment, but I'm definitely down. I like to find honest interlocutors. Not that it's terribly rare. It's actually a lot less rare than I thought once I actually started debating. But
I actually have a debate tonight if you guys are interested in watching with it's on apostatize and I can't think of the guy's channel. He's a Christian. Super nice guy. I'm trying to think of the channel.
It's called apostatize. Is it like apostle? Like
it's called apostatize and it's proselytize and apostatize. And debating a guy named Peter. Oh, now I'm forgetting his name. Maybe his last name is Peters. But anyway, it's on Did Jesus Rise? I think it's gonna be
I love that topic.
An interesting debate. Yeah.
Is it Justin Peters by chance?
No, it's I want to say Chris Peters, but I know that's wrong.
Chris Peters. Yeah, I don't know that. I actually don't know that channel either or that name. So I'll have to look that up. So it's called proselytize and apostatize. Is that what you said? Proselytize. I'll have to look that up.
So one thing I did want to kind of bring up though, just because I do think it's interesting. So in regards to the name, right? Because this has been something that I am somewhat obsessed with the Torah, honestly, always have been. So this has been just kind of stuff that I go into a lot. So we have this this Egyptian root, this suffix which seems to mean child of, that is constantly used even as far back as the 17th century BC with Dudamos. And it is interesting to me how similar that Mose, Moses, all that kind of stuff sounds to Moses or to Moshe. But what's more interesting to me than that is so Masha means to draw, right? And Moshe is said to mean to bring, because I brought him out of the water, right? And this, however you actually say it in Egyptian, I'm not sure, but this Mose root, right, seems to mean child of. And it's interesting to me that if I were a primitive culture, I could easily see how drawing someone out of someone would go on to mean, or would also bear the same meaning as being born from someone. Because when, in fact, this terminology is used that, like, for example, when Abraham has said, from your own loins, right? He's saying that he's going to have one from your own loins. It's almost like it's like Isaac is going to be drawn out of you, drawn out of, you know what I mean? And so I could see how those words could have a relation with each other in the distant past somewhere.
Right.
Well,
Like
and 1800s,
there
1900s.
are even later interpretations in Mishnaic texts, and even early Christian fathers. I believe Origen wrote about it as well, mentioned it as well. That they recognize the difficulty in the identification of Moses in Exodus as being because he was drawn out of the water, and they said, well, wait, no, because it doesn't mean, to be drawn out yourself. It means to draw out, to pull out. And so they said, oh, well, then it must mean it must be a foreshadowing of the crossing of the Red Sea and how he brought the people out of the water.
Well, it also, I think, could be just a little bit, I think simpler than that. Honestly, I think there's a little bit of overthinking there. And what I mean by that is, so I mean, obviously, if you read it, it's Kimin Hamayim Meshetihu, right? Meshetihu doesn't sound very much like Moshe, although you can see Meshi Moshe, right?
That's because it doesn't inherently have the reference to water in it.
Well, right, and I think that's sort of, I guess my point is that it seems to me more like the name it's not like totally encapsulating I drew him out of the water, but I am naming him Moshe because I Masha, or in this case Meshetihu, because that's actually how you would say it, him out of the water, right? Hamayim Meshetihu. In a similar way, you have, like, for example, the name Yahashua, right? It's commonly translated into English as Jehovah saves or Jehovah's salvation, right?
Joshua, yeah.
If you literally translated it, though, it's just, so it's a diminutive form, Yeho, right? And then it's not even actually all of Hosea, it's just Shua, right? Yehoshua. So it doesn't actually literally say Jehovah is salvation, right? But you put the pieces together, and then that's sort of like, it's almost like in memory of that. And I think you could explain Moshe in a similar way.
And then you get to further anglicize it. It's not just about translating it. It's also you're also assigning letters and even sounds that weren't used at the time or in that language.
Let me just interrupt really quickly. Spartan Theology says it's Nick Peters. Is that correct, Jim?
Yes, Nick Peters. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries. And I just wanted to say, I think I have probably about 10 more minutes to go. So I kind of wanted to see if you guys wanted to talk about anything before we get off. And
well, so I'll just make one last point then on the name thing, just to see how you feel about it, Jim. And also, I do want to actually answer the point you just made really quick. Can you remind me of what it was?
Oh, what was that?
The very last point you just made. I kind of lost it.
You were talking about English. I think Anglican is
oh, right.
Can't even talk English versions of language.
Well, and so I guess what I would say about that is, like, that I certainly think that it is possible that we could have a lot of the vowels wrong, for sure. Just as an example, I say Yehovah. A lot of people think it's probably Yahweh. And it could be one or the other. I'm not necessarily like dying on a hill there. I believe on the basis of Nehemiah Gordon's research that it's probably Yehovah. But I do think we have the vowels a little bit more better preserved than we would with other languages, right? Because Hebrew never like died the way like Aramaic died, or
you mean the vocalization of the text, because I mean the verbs themselves didn't exist as a concept.
Yeah, exactly right, exactly, because the Tiberian vowel system which is the one we typically use today, that's like 1000 AD that actually comes out.
Right.
But yeah, the vocalization, it does seem to me that was probably pretty well preserved, just simply because the rabbis have always actually spoke Hebrew, right? It never like completely died the way that like Aramaic or
right. It only died as a spoken text and written text, just in society, but as in a liturgical setting and from a scribal perspective, it still very much was in use in the temple, but it didn't. It still changed. It still developed a lot, but it developed so much during this Mishnaic period that when it did become revived, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that it was really difficult for them to not only relearn the language accurately, but to also integrate these other words that would be loan words.
Well, and it's funny, I reference a lot that I'm taking some Hebrew here, and one of the things that's interesting, kind of to your point, right? The word for lemon is just limon, right? And it's because they didn't have lemon.
Exactly.
Have loan word.
That's a great example.
So you're taking Hebrew class right now?
I am, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So we got a couple people who's studying this, and that's interesting. That's good.
Yeah. So just to mention, you're talking about, like how the later rabbis and stuff like that, they used Hebrew and spoke Hebrew, but some of the early rabbis in rabbinic texts, we see that they noticed the difficulties of identifying Moses, not just as, you had it's people who explain it away as saying, well, it was the Pharaoh's daughter who was saying that because I drew him out, I'll call him Moses. And some of them were saying, well, it's just saying, that's what his mother named him. But some people noticed or acknowledged the difficulty in pushing the date back to the second millennium and the knowledge of the development of Hebrew at that time. And they actually changed his name completely. Some rabbis referred to Moses as what was it? Not Meshatihu. That's what it's already in the Bible. Dadgummit. Oh man, now that's gonna upset me. I can't believe I forgot that. It's on the tip of my tongue.
I hate when
Haver. It said that his name Moses came, from the water I drew him, but his father called him Haver. So they were saying that it was written later as Moses, but originally that's what they called him Haver, because that's something to do with his wife, or that his mom called him Yekutiel because she breastfed him.
She did have him for 3 months before she put him in the water, so it's unlikely he didn't have a name. He has to have a name.
Well, right, but I mean, it was in secrecy also, so she couldn't exactly reveal herself as his mother. In fact, in the biblical tradition, she's introduced as just a maid, a nursemaid, somebody who was still in milk that would be able to provide. Mm-hmm. But in some traditions, she did name him, even though it was done in secrecy. But it was only because it was like a kind of what would you call it, a politeness extended by the Pharaoh's daughter for her work as a nursemaid.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree. I wanted to say hi really quickly to some people in the chat because Sal, I would love to go on your channel, and he said he wanted to invite me on his channel to talk about something in the Book of Acts, and so I would absolutely love to. He's Evidence and Reason, so you guys also go subscribe to him. And if anybody else has a channel here and you guys are interested in having us talk about it or bring people to it, I'll put links to Synagogue and Jim's channel in the description so that you guys can go over there and subscribe to them. And let me just ask you guys, do you guys want to do a couple final parting shots and maybe let people know what you're working on? And that link, Jim, if you could send me that link to this new channel that I've never heard of, I can also spread that so that other people can watch your debate tonight.
Sure. I'm not sure what the link is, but the channel name is Proselytize and Apostatize.
Apostatize. That's just such a strange name.
Yeah. They seem like an interesting gentleman. It seems to be a Christian channel. They do seen quite a few debates on there. I haven't watched any personally, but it should be an interesting time.
Good. Yeah. No, sounds good.
So, SJ, do you mind if I just ask one very brief question?
Oh no, sure.
So because I was just curious. So the oldest known use of masha, although not in that form, it's in a verb form itself, is, depending on what exactly came first, because they're actually repetitions of the same thing, either Psalm 18 or 2 Samuel 22.
Yeah, probably in the Coptic, right?
Well, actually, no. Even in the original Hebrew, it's the English is "He sent from above, He took me, He drew me out of waters, drew me out of many waters." And the Hebrew would read in the "He drew me," it's a Yemesheni Mimyaim, I think is how you'd say that. Mimyaim.
Right. Well, the additional letters is just the he and me and things like that. But the part that's debated is whether it is being drawn out or to be the one who draws out. So
So I guess my question though because this psalm is commonly accepted even by a lot of secularists I know, though not all of them for sure, to actually be likely written by David. Would you accept that? And if so, wouldn't that push use of Masha back at least to the very tail end of the second millennium?
Well, I don't think that any of the biblical texts were written at the time of David. I mean, the most biblical texts that we have, were probably written somewhere after the Babylonian exile. I'd say, like at the latest, late 5th century, early 6th century. I'm sorry, late 6th century, possibly early 7th century, but that's very, very highly debated. So I mean, I don't think that any Hebrew in the Bible even extends back far enough to make that argument personally.
So you think because I mean, the whole Psalms, a lot of the Psalms are attributed to David, and Solomon gets attributions for Proverbs. So you think that that's just sort of a lie that somebody just made up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of traditions in many religions, and not even just religions, just in cultural traditions that are completely made up.
Okay. I just want to clarify your position. I wanted to say, Danny, I did watch your debate with, not your chat, I should say, with Dr. Stratton. That was awesome. I loved that. You were very polite, and I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, bring that guy back on. He was great to listen to. So.
One more thing that I want to clarify, just it's not necessarily about Moses specifically, but I just want to make sure that people know that biblical names, like the etymologies for these names, it often reflected a much deeper meaning than just what they were named. So in many cases, it's highly unlikely that these were historical people. Rather, these are characters given names that would be read in the original language, would be interpreted as having some very very symbolic meaning, whether a foreshadowing of an event later in that person's life, or what that person was destined to do, or this is something along those lines.
I actually agree with you there, and I think that's another reason why I like Ivan Panin's stuff so well, because he took the Hebrew and he took the Greek and he looked at the numerical value, because as you know, there's numerical values and they don't have number symbols like we do, and so he looked at the numerical value of a lot of names, and like Jesus, apparently looking at that name, it turns out it's 888, which has some significance in a divine way. So, and I don't know, there was it's really cool because he added up a lot of names and looked at what their numerical symbols were. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
Did he do Nero by any chance?
Yeah, Nero 666.
That's right.
Well, actually, that's
well, Neron.
You have to kind of mess with
Neron is 666. How he would have been colloquially referred to in the Jewish community would have been Neron, and that translates to 666.
Well, even then, it has to be Neron Kaiser, and
Yes.
There's also some dispute. Irenaeus actually says that's 616 that Neron Kaiser comes. Now, I don't know who's right, but that is just a. I don't know. I've had to argue that one a lot just because I think that some people.
Yeah, that's a whole other mountain that we'd have to make out of this.
Yeah, for sure.
That's another. Yeah, we could really. That would be kind of fun to talk about that. Well, you guys, I really enjoy having you on my channel. I know, Jim, you and I we've had a little bit of a rocky past, but you've been very polite today, and it's been really a nice time. It's been nice having you on here, and of course, it's always fun having CJ on here too. So, do you guys want to? I'm going to find links to your channels and put them in here. And if there's anything else you want to share before we part.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you guys let me come on. And I have requested to follow you on Twitter. So if you'd like me to follow you, I'd be happy to. Okay.
Yeah, you can. If you do that again, I think I went down and I rejected all the requests that were in there. Okay. So if you do it again, you can follow me and I'll follow you back and we'll go from there. So
great.
So good. Okay. Well, listen, thank you guys so much for coming in. I have to tell you a really quick story. This morning I went for a bike ride because I thought it would be a fun idea, and I go for bike rides every day. And so I'm riding through the neighborhood and I thought it was just going to be a little teeny bit of rain. And all of a sudden it just started dumping on me, just in the worst way. And so then I started racing home, and my husband called me. He was going to come pick me up in his truck, and I'm racing home as fast as I can. And then I heard thunder. And so I started getting scared because I didn't want to get hit by lightning. And so I'm going as quickly as I can. I finally get home and I'm totally soaked. And then my husband's like, I'm going to take my blood pressure. You want to take yours? My blood pressure was through the roof.
Oh my gosh, I bet.
And then I went to, then he's like, oh my gosh, we got to haul you down to the urgent care. So,
no.
So we went to Publix actually instead, and I took my blood pressure again, still through the roof. Then I get back home, I take my blood pressure again. It's starting to come down. So I got to go check what it is right now. I think it should hopefully be back to normal because I normally don't have high blood pressure.
Well, that's good. I hope me being on the channel didn't contribute to that any.
No, I think it worked out. It worked out well.
Okay. So you guys have a great day.
Yeah, you too. And I'm going to try to watch your thing tonight. I'm going to be on the road a little bit, but I'll try to catch it. And so thank you. And Synagogue, great to see you again. I look forward to watching you guys debate again.
Yeah, good to see both of you. And I just, as a brief thing, I just want to say to any other Christian apologists out there, we should totally make this a thing that we are talking about, because everybody gets all up in arms about Jesus mythicism, but Moses mythicism, I looked it up, Jim. Mine and your debate was the only debate that showed up when I looked up, did Moses exist debate on YouTube. That might just be my luck, but that's weak. You know what I mean? So you can find more stuff about Arthur's existence.
I think Abraham too. What about Abraham? Wouldn't that be a good debate?
Yeah, I think that with Abraham, there's even less evidence. I mean, I think for most of the patristic era, I don't think most people believe that any of those people existed. But as far as the Moses debate, I don't know if you know this or not, CJ, but I've been trying for almost 2 years, I'd say, and to get a debate on that.
Nice. I am happy to have helped facilitate that. Then actually, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I was absolutely stoked whenever I saw it on Twitter, and I saw that you had commented some other people, to as suggestions to debate. And I said, oh man, I better jump on this real quick.
That was a good one too. That was actually one of my favorite debates I've been in so far.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Yeah, good. So that's great. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast, you guys. Just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And so, if you guys stick.